My family laughed when I saved Grandpa's wallet from our dog. They stopped laughing when they found out what was inside. You know what they say about being the middle child? Well, try being the other son. Not Mark. Never Mark. Mark was a golden boy, the shining star in my parents' constellation of hopes and dreams. While I spent my days swinging hammers and laying foundations for other people's dreams, Mark was busy painting pretty pictures of his next big venture. I'm Jack, by the way, 40 years old, and still feeling like that scrawny kid who could never quite measure up. Construction's been my life since I graduated high school, not because I didn't have dreams, but because someone had to be practical while Mark chased rainbows. My callous hands told a different story than his soft ones, but apparently calluses don't count for much at family dinners. The bitterness had been building for years, like sediment in an old pipe. Every family gathering was the same script, just different dollar amounts. Dad would lean back in his leather chair. Mom would beam with pride, and they'd hand Mark another check for whatever brilliant idea had struck him that month. Meanwhile, I'd sit there nursing a beer, watching my wife Emily squeeze my hand under the table because she knew I was about to explode. This particular Sunday started like all the others. Mom's chocolate chip cookies filled the house with that warm, homey smell that used to make everything feel safe when I was a kid. Now it just reminded me of everything I wasn't getting. The living room looked the same as it had for 20 years. Same beige carpet, same family photos where Mark's smile always seemed brighter than mine. Same dad holding court from his recliner like some kind of suburban king. The whole ritual was about to begin. I could feel in the air, thick as humidity before a storm. Dad cleared his throat, that familiar sound that meant business. Mom bustled around with coffee and those cookies, playing the perfect hostess while the real show was about to start. And there was Mark, 35 years old, and still looking like he'd stepped out of a catalog. Clean hands, perfect hair, that confident smile that said the world owed him something. He had this way of sitting forward in his chair, all eager and bright-eyed, like a dog waiting for a treat. Dad pulled out the checkbook. The same leather checkbook he'd been using since I was in diapers, probably worth more than my truck. The ceremony was always the same. The dramatic pause, the speech about investing in the future, the way Mark's eyes would light up like Christmas morning. $150,000. That's what the check said this time. For Mark's revolutionary food truck concept that was going to disrupt the entire industry. I'd heard it all before. The tech startup, the real estate venture, the cryptocurrency thing that was definitely not a scam this time. Every single one had crashed and burned, but somehow that never seemed to matter. Dad would just shake his head, say something about lessons learned and experience gained, and get ready to write the next check. Meanwhile, I've been busting my back building actual things, houses people lived in, offices where real work got done. And the most financial support I'd ever gotten was a $20 bill tucked into a birthday card. The unfairness of it all sat in my stomach like a rock. Here I was, reliable old Jack, showing up to every family dinner, helping Dad fix his fence without being asked, never missing Mom's birthday. But Mark could disappear for months, blow through more money than I made in 3 years, and still be treated like the prodigal son every time he walked through the door. Emily caught my eye from across the room. She was standing by Mom's china cabinet, pretending to admire the same pieces she'd seen 100 times before. But I knew that look. She was giving me the signal, the one that said, "Breathe, Jack, just breathe." 22 years of marriage had taught her to read my moods like a weather forecast, and right now she could see the storm clouds gathering. My hands were clenched so tight my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to relax, to take one of those deep breaths Emily was always talking about. Count to 10, she'd say, "Remember what really matters." All that Zen stuff that was supposed to keep me from saying something I'd regret. Then I saw Buster in the corner, happily chewing on something. At first I didn't think much of it, until I recognized what it was. Grandpa's wallet. My chest tightened. That old leather thing had been through wars, businesses, and more stories than any of us would ever know. Grandpa used to say it had seen more of America than most people ever would. And now it was getting torn up while my family celebrated another one of Mark's visions. I crossed the room, knelt down, and gently pulled it from his jaws. The teeth marks didn't matter. What mattered was what it meant. and for the first time in years, I couldn't stay quiet. The words exploded out of me before I could stop them, my voice cutting to the polite family chatter like a chainsaw through silk. The room went dead silent. Mom dropped her coffee cup back onto its saucer with a loud clink. Mark's head snapped up from his check admiring session. Dad's face darkened like a thundercloud rolling in off the prairie. Dad's response was everything I'd come to expect from him and worse. He looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd found stuck to his shoe. His voice carried that particular brand of condescension he'd perfected over the years, the tone that said I was being unreasonable, emotional, dramatic. That old thing? If I wanted it so bad, I could take it. It was probably all I'd ever get anyway. He threw the words off like he was talking about the weather, casual and dismissive and cruel, in that special way only family can manage. He didn't know how prophetic those words would turn out to be. Hell, I didn't know either. All I knew was that I felt smaller and more worthless than I had since I was 12 years old, getting lectured about not living up to my potential. But something else was happening too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at the time. Emily was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not pity, not embarrassment, but something that looked almost like pride. I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. My hands were shaking as I tucked the wallet into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight settle against my chest like a talisman. Emily fell into step beside me, without a word, as I headed for the front door. The late afternoon sun hit my face as we stepped outside, and I took my first deep breath in what felt like hours. Emily slipped her hand into mine, her fingers warm and familiar and reassuring. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. There wasn't much to say. We both knew what had just happened, and we both knew there was no going back. The family dynamics that had been set in stone for decades had just shifted, and nobody was quite sure what came next. As we pulled into our driveway, I patted my jacket pocket where Grandpa's wallet rested. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying more than old leather and memories. For the next few days, I walked around like a zombie. The fight with Dad kept replaying in my head like a broken record, each time hitting harder than the last. His words echoed in the empty spaces of my skull, casual, cruel, cutting deeper than any insult he'd ever thrown my way. The wallet sat on my nightstand like a silent accusation, chewed up, scarred, looking as beaten down as I felt inside. Emily tried to cheer me up with my favorite dinner, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the kind of comfort food that usually made everything better. But I just pushed the food around my plate, lost in my own head. She didn't push, didn't try to force conversation. 22 years of marriage had taught her when to give me space to work through my mess. But that wallet kept calling to me. Every time I looked at it, I saw Grandpa's weathered hands, heard his voice telling stories about the old days. He'd been my anchor when everything else felt unstable, the one person who never made me feel like I was failing at life just by existing. Tuesday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and that mangled piece of leather. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across its surface, highlighting every tooth mark Buster had left behind. It looked like it had been through a war zone, which, considering our family dynamics, wasn't far from the truth. I started working on it slowly, carefully, not trying to make it perfect, just trying to give it some dignity back. The leather was soft and supple despite its age, worn smooth by decades of riding in Grandpa's back pocket. Every scratch told a story I'd never hear. Every stain was a memory I'd never share. Grandpa had this saying he'd repeat whenever life got complicated. He'd lean back in his old recliner, take a long drag from his pipe, and say that the biggest treasures were usually hidden in the places nobody thought to look. I always figured he was talking about life lessons or family values, the kind of wisdom old men pass down to keep young men from making the same mistakes they did. Turns out he might have been more literal than I realized. As I worked the leather, trying to smooth out some of the deeper gouges, my fingers found something odd. The inside seemed thicker than it should be, like there was something between the layers. At first, I thought it was just old padding. Maybe some cardboard Grandpa had stuck in there to keep it from wearing through. But when I pressed harder, I felt edges, sharp, defined corners that definitely weren't supposed to be there. My pulse quickened as I ran my fingertips along what felt like a hidden seam, so perfectly concealed I never would have found it if I hadn't been looking for damage to repair. Grandpa had been full of surprises when he was alive. Magic tricks for us kids, hidden candy stashes Mom never found, secret fishing spots he'd only share with family. The man had been like a benevolent trickster, always pulling something unexpected out of thin air. This felt exactly like something he'd do, hide a little surprise for whoever cared enough to really look. I worked at the seam carefully, afraid of damaging whatever was inside. The stitching was so fine, it was almost invisible, done by someone who knew their way around leather work. Finally, I felt it give way, and my fingers found a slim pocket I never knew existed. What I pulled out looked like it had been sleeping in that wallet for decades. A piece of paper, yellow with age and folded so many times the creases had become permanent. It felt fragile in my hands, like it might crumble if I breathed on it wrong. The paper had that particular smell old documents get, musty, important, full of secrets. When I unfolded it, my coffee went cold in the cup. It was covered in official-looking seals and stamps, with text that looked like it had been typed on one of those old typewriters that left slightly uneven letters. At the top, in bold letters that somehow managed to look both faded and urgent, were the words United States Treasury Bond. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake. Or maybe a replica, the kind of thing they sell in museum gift shops to tourists who want to own a piece of history. Grandpa had always been interested in American history. Maybe this was just a souvenir from some trip he'd taken before I was born. But the paper felt too real, too official. The serial numbers were precise, the signatures looked authentic, and there was a weight to it that fake documents never have. This wasn't some tourist trinket. This was a real deal. I sat there staring at this piece of paper, like it was written in a foreign language. In a way, it was the language of finance and government bonds was about as familiar to me as ancient Greek. I understood construction contracts and building permits, not Treasury securities and federal obligations. But I understood numbers. And the numbers on this document were making my head spin. The denomination was clear enough, printed in large numerals that left no room for misinterpretation. But it was so far beyond anything I'd ever imagined that my brain refused to process it properly. My hands were shaking as I booted up the ancient laptop Emily used for her book club meetings. The thing took forever to start up, wheezing and grinding like it was personally offended by being asked to work. While I waited, I kept staring at the document, half convinced it would disappear if I looked away for too long. The Treasury Department website looked official enough to be legitimate, with all the boring government formatting and unnecessarily complicated navigation that screams federal bureaucracy. I found the section for verifying old securities, typed in the serial number with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else, and held my breath. The screen flickered. Loading some more. I swear that little spinning wheel was deliberately torturing me, taking its sweet time to deliver what was probably going to be disappointing news. This was probably some kind of expired bond from the 1940s, worth maybe enough to buy dinner at a decent restaurant if I was lucky. Then the results page loaded, and my world tilted sideways. The number that appeared on screen made my vision blur. 8 digits followed by 6 zeros, staring back at me like they were mocking everything I thought I knew about reality. My legs gave out, just completely stopped working, like someone had cut the power cord to my knees. I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, staring up at the laptop screen, feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train carrying nothing but confusion and disbelief. This couldn't be real. This was the kind of thing that happened to other people who bought lottery tickets and found oil in their backyard. Not to guys like me who built other people's dreams and got lectured about taking life seriously. Not to the family disappointment who couldn't even get his parents to notice when he fixed their fence without being asked. But there it was, staring back at me from the official U.S. Treasury website. Valid, current, legally binding. The kind of money that changes everything, forever, in ways you can't even imagine until it's sitting right there in front of you. I thought about Grandpa, about all those times he'd told us kids that money wasn't everything, about how he'd worked construction his whole life, lived in the same modest house for 50 years, drove pickup trucks until they literally fell apart. He'd never acted like a man with millions hidden away. He'd never acted like anything other than a hard-working guy who loved his family and believed in doing right by people. Maybe he'd forgotten about it. Maybe he bought it decades ago and stuck in his wallet for safekeeping. Then life got busy and it slipped his mind. Hell, I lose my car keys twice a week. Maybe forgetting about this kind of money wasn't as impossible as it sounded. Or maybe this was exactly what he'd meant about treasures being hidden where nobody thought to look. Maybe this was his final magic trick. One last surprise for whoever cared enough to really pay attention. The man who'd taught me that honest work was its own reward had left me a reward that made honest work look like pocket change. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had thrown that wallet at me like it was worthless, like it was all failure like me deserved. He'd meant it as an insult, a final reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. But sitting there on my kitchen floor, holding a piece of paper worth more than my parents' house, their cars, and probably their entire retirement fund combined, I realized he'd given me the greatest gift of my life. The practical part of my brain started firing questions faster than I could process them. Was this even legal? Could I actually claim it? What were the tax implications? Did Dad have any legal right to it since it technically came from his father? Would there be paperwork, investigations, bureaucratic nightmares that would eat up more time and money than the discovery was worth? But underneath all the practical concerns was something bigger, something that felt like the universe finally deciding to balance the scales. For 40 years, I'd watched my family invest in Mark's dreams while treating my reality like it didn't matter. For 40 years, I'd been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who showed up and did the work without expecting recognition or reward. And now, holding this impossible piece of paper in my trembling hands, I wondered if maybe Grandpa had seen something in me that nobody else bothered to notice. Maybe this was an accident or a forgotten investment. Maybe this was his way of making sure the right person got what they deserved, even if he couldn't be around to see it happen. The document felt heavier than paper should, like it was weighted down with possibility and responsibility and the kind of life-changing potential that most people only dream about. Enough to never worry about money again. Enough to build the construction company I'd always dreamed of. Enough to show my family that the son they'd written off was worth more than they'd ever imagined. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its usual evening routine. Kids being called in for dinner, garage doors rumbling open as people came home from work. The familiar sound of ordinary life continuing like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the space of 15 minutes, I'd gone from being the family failure to being the guy holding the one thing my father had tossed aside like garbage. The question was what came next, and whether this amazing discovery was going to be the blessing it seemed like, or if it was going to tear my already complicated family apart at the seams. I sat there on the floor, holding what felt like the weight of my entire family's legacy, and honestly didn't know if I just found a blessing or a loaded grenade. After staring at that loaded grenade for what felt like hours, I knew I needed help. This wasn't the kind of thing you figured out from YouTube videos or Wikipedia articles. This was serious money, the kind that comes with serious complications, and I needed someone who understood the legal maze I was about to walk into. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I spent the next 3 nights hunched over my laptop, diving deep into the rabbit hole of bearer bonds, treasury securities, and inheritance law. The more I read, the more my head spun with terms like negotiable instruments and statutory limitations and fiduciary responsibility. Emily found me at 4 a.m. on Thursday, still at the kitchen table surrounded by printed articles and legal documents, my eyes bloodshot and my coffee cup cold as ice. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder and squeezed. That simple gesture said more than 1,000 words ever could. She was with me, whatever came next. I needed a specialist, not just any lawyer, but someone who dealt with old financial instruments, someone who could tell me if what I was holding was real gold or fool's gold dressed up in fancy paper. After making a dozen phone calls and getting transferred more times than a hot potato, I finally found my guy, Dr. Richard Morrison. And yes, he insisted on being called Doctor, ran a consulting firm that specialized in what he called orphan securities. The man had a voice like a college professor and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're talking about. When I explained my situation over the phone, There was a long pause that made my stomach drop. Then he started laughing. Not the kind of laugh that says you're crazy, but the kind that says you've just told him the most interesting thing he's heard all year. He agreed to meet me that Saturday at his office downtown, and I could hear the excitement in his voice when he hung up. Dr. Morrison's office looked exactly like you'd expect floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, degrees covering every wall, and the kind of organized chaos that screams brilliant but eccentric. The man himself was in his 60s, with wild gray hair and glasses that had seen better decades. When I handed him the bond, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled out a magnifying glass that looked like it belonged in a Sherlock Holmes movie and started examining every inch of that paper, like it was a Dead Sea Scrolls. For 10 minutes, he didn't say a word, just muttered and nodded, and made little notes on a legal pad. When he finally looked up, his eyes were practically glowing. What I was holding, he explained with the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store, was a bearer bond, one of the last of its kind still floating around in the wild. These things had been phased out in 1982 as part of a crackdown on money laundering and tax evasion, but the ones that were already out there remain valid. The kicker? Whoever physically held the bond was the legal owner. No names, no registration, no paper trail. It was like cash, but cash worth millions of dollars. Dr. Morrison called it the financial equivalent of a unicorn, and judging by the way his hands were shaking as he held it, he wasn't exaggerating. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning twice in 1 week. First the discovery, now the confirmation that it was not only real, but practically bulletproof from a legal standpoint. It was like Grandpa had reached out from beyond the grave and handed me the winning lottery ticket, along with a wink that said, "I told you treasures were hidden where nobody looks." But I should have known that nothing this good comes without a fight. In small towns, news travels faster than gossip at a church potluck, and somehow word got out that Jack the construction worker had stumbled into more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Dad found out on Tuesday. I know, because that's when my phone started ringing with calls I didn't want to answer. His voice was different from the usual disappointed father tone I'd grown up with. This was pure rage, the kind that comes from realizing you've made a mistake that costs you millions of dollars. The first few calls were just shouting, accusations flying like bullets in a war zone. I was a thief, a liar, a snake who'd stolen from his own family. How dare I take advantage of an old man's forgotten belongings? How could I be so selfish, so greedy, so typical of everything that was wrong with my character? By Thursday, the calls had turned into threats. Legal action, he said, lawsuits that would tie up the money for years. He'd prove I had no right to that bond, that it belonged to him as Grandpa's heir, that I was nothing more than a scavenger picking through the family leftovers. I tried to remind him that he'd literally thrown the wallet at me, told me it was all I'd ever get. But logic wasn't what he was operating on anymore. This was about pride, about control, about the natural order of things where Mark got the money and I got the scraps. Friday evening, things escalated beyond phone calls. I was in my garage, working on a side project to keep my hands busy and my mind off the chaos, when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Dad's Mercedes parked next to Mark's BMW, like they were planning a hostile takeover of my little suburban kingdom. They didn't knock. Just walked into my garage like they owned the place, Dad leading the charge and Mark trailing behind like a nervous backup singer. The confrontation that followed was everything I'd expected and worse. Two grown men demanding a hand over what they considered rightfully theirs. Dad was in full businessman mode, all sharp edges and calculated aggression. He'd done his research, he said, spoken to lawyers, found precedents. The bond belonged to the estate, and since he was the executor, it belonged to him. My possession of it was technically theft, and if I didn't return it voluntarily, he'd make sure I regretted it in court. Mark just stood there nodding along like a bobblehead, occasionally chiming in with comments about family loyalty and doing the right thing. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. The golden boy who'd never worked a day in his life trying to lecture me about ethics. I stood my ground. Politely but firmly, I reminded them both that the wallet had been given to me, that the bond was a bearer instrument, that according to Dr. Morrison's research, Possession really was 9/10 of the law in this case, but I might as well have been talking to a brick wall. They'd already made up their minds, and facts weren't going to change anything. Within a week, I had legal papers in my mailbox. Dad and Mark were suing me for return of family property, claiming I'd taken advantage of an elderly man's declining mental state to steal what wasn't mine. Reading those accusations felt like being punched in the gut by someone wearing brass knuckles. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in late November. I'd hired my own lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chun, who specialized in inheritance disputes and had a reputation for not backing down from bullies. She was everything Dad's high-priced attorney wasn't: direct, honest, and more interested in facts than intimidation tactics. The courtroom was one of those wood-paneled affairs that screamed serious business, with American flags and portraits of dead judges staring down from the walls. Dad and Mark sat on one side with their lawyer, looking like they'd already won. I sat on the other side with Patricia, trying not to let my nerves show. Their attorney came out swinging, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who'd taken advantage of family tragedy for personal gain. He had charts, precedents, and a whole presentation about the sanctity of family property and the legal obligations of estate inheritance. It was impressive, I'll give him that, the kind of performance that probably worked on juries who didn't know the whole story. Patricia's response was surgical in its precision. She laid out the facts without drama or flourish: the bearer bond law, the legal significance of voluntary transfer, the clear evidence that I'd been given the wallet without coercion or deception. Her argument was simple. You can't sue someone for keeping a gift you gave them, especially when that gift contains legal tender. The tension in that courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dad kept shooting me looks that could have melted steel, while Mark fidgeted in his chair like a kid who needed to use the bathroom. The judge, a woman who looked like she'd seen every con game and sob story in the book, listened to both sides with a kind of neutral expression that revealed nothing. Then Emily stood up, my quiet, reserved wife who usually avoided confrontation like the plague, rose from the gallery and asked permission to address the court. I had no idea what she was planning, but something in her voice made my heart race with both fear and hope. What happened next was the kind of moment that makes you believe in divine intervention. Emily calmly pulled out her phone and explained to the judge that she had video evidence that might clarify the situation. Before anyone could object, she was playing the recording she'd made at that disastrous family dinner. The courtroom went dead silent as Dad's voice filled the air, his words dripping with the same contempt and dismissal I'd heard that Sunday afternoon. There he was, in high-definition audio, telling me to take the wallet because it was probably all I'd ever get anyway. His voice, his words, his complete and voluntary transfer of the property in question. I watched Dad's face go through about 6 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. First confusion, then recognition, then horror as he realized what Emily had captured. Mark looked like he wanted to disappear into his expensive suit, probably realizing for the first time that their entire case had just evaporated into thin air. The judge didn't need to deliberate. After reviewing the video evidence and consulting the relevant statutes on bearer bonds and voluntary property transfer, she dismissed the case with what might have been the ghost of a smile. The bond was mine, legally and ethically, end of story. Walking out of that courthouse felt like floating on air. After 4 decades of being the family's screw-up, the disappointment, the son who couldn't live up to expectations, I was finally something different. I was the guy who'd been given something valuable and had the backbone to keep it when the bullies came calling. Dad and Mark didn't say a word as we passed them in the hallway. Dad's face was the color of old concrete, and Mark was staring at his shoes like they held the secret to the universe. The Golden Boy's latest get-rich-quick scheme had crashed and burned just like all the others, except this time he'd taken Dad down with him. Emily slipped her hand into mine as we walked toward the parking garage, and I could feel her pride radiating like warmth from a campfire. She'd been my secret weapon, my ace in the hole, the one person who thought to document Dad's cruelty for posterity. Without her, I might have lost everything to their legal maneuvering and expensive lawyers. That night, sitting at our kitchen table with the bond tucked away in a place even Dad's lawyers couldn't touch, I finally allowed myself to believe it was real. The money, the victory, The sweet taste of justice served with side of humble pie for the people who'd spent decades treating me like a second-class family member. But even as I celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a beginning. Money changes everything, they say, and I was about to find out exactly how true that was. The question wasn't whether I could handle being wealthy. The question was whether my family could handle me being wealthier than all of them combined. This time, I walked out as someone new, but I couldn't quite believe this was really the end of the fight. That fight I thought was over? Turns out it was just the opening act. The real show started a few weeks after the court victory, when the legal machinery finally ground through all its bureaucratic gears and delivered what I'd never really believed would happen. I was sitting in the branch manager's office at First National, watching him type numbers into his computer with the kind of careful precision you'd use to defuse a bomb. $8,437,612. That's what the bond was actually worth after decades of accumulated interest. The manager, a guy named Steve who looked like he'd seen everything the banking world could throw at him, kept glancing at me like I might be running some elaborate con game. Nobody walks into a small-town bank with a bearer bond worth more than most lottery jackpots. But there it was, validated by the Treasury Department, rubber-stamped by the court system, and now officially mine. When Steve finally hit that final key and the transfer went through, something shifted in my chest. It wasn't just the money, though Lord knows that was life-changing enough. It was a feeling that the universe had finally stopped playing favorites and decided to deal me a hand from the top of the deck instead of the bottom. Dad and Mark had gone radio silent after the court ruling. No more angry phone calls, no more surprise visits, no more threats about appeals and higher courts. Their silence was louder than all their shouting had ever been. It was a sound of pride swallowing itself, of golden boys realizing their shine had worn off, of bullies discovering that sometimes a quiet kid hits back. Emily found me that evening sitting on our back porch, just staring out the neighborhood I'd looked at the same way for 20 years. But everything felt different now. The modest houses, the chain-link fences, the pickup trucks and driveways, it all looked smaller somehow, like I was seeing it from a great height. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me and took my hand. We'd been through enough together that words weren't always necessary. She knew what I was thinking. What comes next? How do you go from being the family disappointment to being richer than everyone who'd ever looked down on you? How do you handle that kind of cosmic irony without losing your mind or your soul? The answer, it turned out, was simple. You remember who you are and where you came from. You remember that Grandpa didn't leave you millions, so you could turn into the kind of person he'd have been ashamed to know. I didn't quit my job right away. That might sound crazy, keeping a construction gig when you've got $8 million in the bank. But I needed time to think, to plan, to make sure I didn't end up like Mark with a pile of money and no idea what to do with it. I'd watched too many lottery winners go broke in 5 years to think that money alone solved anything. Instead, I started small. Paid off our mortgage, which felt better than any drug I could imagine. Bought Emily that little Honda Accord she'd been wanting for 3 years, but never mentioned because we couldn't afford it. Set aside money for taxes, because the IRS doesn't care how you came by your wealth as long as they get their cut. Then I started thinking bigger. I'd spent 25 years building other people's dreams. Maybe it was time to build my own. The construction company I'd always talked about, but never had the capital to start. The kind of outfit that treated workers like human beings instead of disposable equipment. That built things to last instead of cutting corners for profit. Within 6 months, Morrison Construction was more than just a business license and a dream. I'd rented office space in a converted warehouse downtown, hired 3 crews of guys I'd worked with over the years, and landed our first major contract, a subdivision of starter homes for young families who deserved better than the cardboard boxes most builders were passing off as houses. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from being Jack the employee to Jack the boss, from building other people's visions to having crews build mine. My name was on the trucks, my signature was on the paychecks, and my reputation was what stood behind every nail we drove and every board we cut. But the real satisfaction came from something else entirely. I'd started a program for young workers, kids straight out of high school who needed a chance but couldn't afford trade school. We'd train them, mentor them, give them the opportunity. I'd never had to learn the business from the ground up with someone who actually cared about their success. It was around this time that Dad and Mark started calling again, not with threats or demands this time, but with a different kind of desperation in their voices. Mark's latest venture, some kind of app that was supposed to revolutionize food delivery, had crashed and burned spectacularly. Apparently, he convinced several investors to back his guaranteed success. And when it tanked, he lost not just his own money, but theirs too. Dad, meanwhile, had made some questionable investment decisions trying to recoup what he felt he'd lost when I won the court case. Something about cryptocurrency and a financial advisor who turned out to be better at spending other people's money than making it grow. The details were fuzzy, but the result was clear. They were in trouble. The phone calls started casual enough. How was I doing? Great to hear about the business success. Family should stick together, especially during tough times. But I could hear what they weren't saying as clearly as what they were. They needed help, and I was the only one in the family with the resources to provide it. Part of me. The part that remembered every slight, every dismissive comment. Every time they made me feel like I wasn't worth their attention, wanted to tell them exactly where they could stick their sudden interest in family solidarity. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. That wasn't who Grandpa had raised me to be. When they finally worked up the courage to ask directly, I didn't make them grovel. I didn't lecture them about karma or cosmic justice or the irony of the family failure bailing out the golden boy. I just listened to what they needed, thought about what I could live with, and made them an offer. I'd help Mark restart his business, but this time I'd be a silent partner with veto power over major decisions. No more throwing good money after bad. No more chasing get-rich-quick schemes that sounded too good to be true. If he wanted my money, he'd have to earn it the same way everyone else did, through hard work, smart decisions, and results that spoke for themselves. For Dad, I offered something different. A consulting contract with Morrison Construction, where his decades of business experience could actually help build something lasting instead of just enabling Mark's latest fantasy. He'd have to work for his money, but it would be real work with real value, not charity disguised as family obligation. The look on their faces when I laid out these terms was worth more than the $8 million I'd inherited. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one setting conditions, making demands, deciding what was acceptable and what wasn't. The power dynamic that had defined our family for 40 years had flipped completely upside down. They took the deals. Of course they did. Pride doesn't pay the bills, and their options were limited. But something interesting happened over the following months. When Mark actually had to work for his success instead of just talking about it, he turned out to be halfway decent at running a legitimate business. And Dad, when he wasn't focused on playing favorites, actually had valuable insights about management and growth strategy. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Too much water had passed under that bridge for us to suddenly become the Brady Bunch. But it was something healthier than what we'd had before. A relationship based on mutual respect instead of established hierarchy, where everyone contributed something and everyone got something in return. Emily and I moved into a new house that spring. Nothing ostentatious, just a well-built place with good bones and enough space for the life we wanted to live. I designed it myself, and my crews had built it, so every nail and board was exactly where I wanted it. It felt like the physical manifestation of everything I'd worked toward, solid, honest, built to last. The old wallet sat on my desk in the home office, right next to family photos and business awards that still surprised me every time I saw them. Sometimes I'd pick it up and run my fingers over the leather, thinking about Grandpa and the chain of events that had led from his forgotten hiding place to my completely transformed life. Buster was getting old by then, gray around the muzzle, slower on the stairs, but still the same good-natured mutt who'd started this whole adventure by chewing on something he shouldn't have. Emily had made him a special bed next to my desk, and he'd spend hours there while I worked, like he was keeping guard over the office that his curiosity had made possible. On quiet evenings, when the construction crews had gone home and the phone had stopped ringing with business calls, I'd sit in that office and marvel at how completely my life had changed. Not just the money, though that had certainly opened doors I'd never imagined walking through, but the confidence, the respect, The feeling that I was finally exactly who I was supposed to be. The family gatherings were different now, too. We still had them. Emily insisted that success shouldn't mean abandoning tradition, but the dynamics had shifted in ways that went beyond mere financial standings. I was no longer the odd man out, the one whose opinions didn't matter, the son who'd somehow failed to live up to his potential. Dad still gave advice, but now he asked for mine too. Mark still pitched ideas, but now he ran them by me before committing family resources. Mom still made her famous cookies, but now she asked about my business with genuine interest instead of polite obligation. It was like someone had taken the family portrait and rearranged all the pieces into a picture that actually made sense. The success of Morrison Construction had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Word gets around fast in construction business, especially when you're doing quality work at fair prices and treating your employees like human beings. We'd grown from 3 crews to 12, from starter homes to commercial projects, from a local outfit to a regional presence that was getting noticed by developers 3 states away. But the real measure of success wasn't the bottom line, or the industry recognition, or even the respect I'd finally earned from my family. It was in the young workers we'd trained who were now running their own crews, the families living in houses my company had built, the community projects we'd taken on, because they needed doing, not because they were profitable. I'd learned something that Mark never had, something that all his business school education and entrepreneurial ambitions had somehow missed. Success isn't about getting rich quick or finding the perfect scheme or convincing other people to fund your dreams. It's about building something real, something that serves a purpose beyond making money, something that leaves the world a little better than you found it. On weekends, Emily and I would drive around town, pointing out projects Morrison Construction had completed, houses where young families were building their lives, office buildings where small businesses were chasing their own versions of the American dream, community centers where kids were learning that hard work and honest dealing could actually pay off in the long run. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about the alternate universe where Buster hadn't chewed on that wallet, where I'd never discovered what Grandpa had hidden away, where I'd spend the rest of my life being the family disappointment who built other people's dreams while his own gathered dust. It was a sobering thought, but not a depressing one, because even in that universe, I had been married to Emily, surrounded by the work I loved, living a life that might not have been extraordinary but would have been honest and decent in mine. The money had changed everything, but it hadn't changed who I was at my core. I was still Jack the construction worker, still the guy who believed in doing things right the first time, still the son who'd rather earn respect than inherit it. I'd just finally gotten a chance to prove that those values were worth something after all. Standing in my office today, looking out at the downtown skyline that includes 3 buildings my company helped create, I still sometimes can't believe this is my life. The business that started with Grandpa's forgotten bond now employs over 100 people. The family that once treated me like an afterthought now comes to me for advice. The community that barely knew I existed now knows Morrison Construction as a name they can trust. Buster is napping in a spot by the window. Emily is downstairs planning our vacation to Alaska, something we'd talked about for years but never thought we could afford. And my phone is buzzing with calls from contractors who want to work with us, not because they have to, but because we've built a reputation worth being associated with. Justice moves slowly sometimes, like a river that takes decades to carve its path through solid rock. But when it finally breaks through, when the current finds its way to where it was always meant to flow, the result is something that feels less like luck and more like inevitability. This wasn't just about money or family dynamics or the random discovery of a forgotten treasure. This was about a universe that had been watching and waiting for the right moment to set things right. Looking at them now, I see that justice, though slow, always finds its path. And for once in my life, I'm not just part of the story. I'm the one holding the pen. If you know your time is coming and you'll get what's yours too, right, justice will prevail. Share your story about overcoming unfairness or about an unexpected gift from fate. I'm waiting for your thoughts.